Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia SEM-V tutorial series. Today we're having a look at the VCF, voltage controlled filter. If you're enjoying this series and you want to help support me, check out the Patreon or YouTube member links below. Fabulous way to do that. Okay, what's a VCF? Well, a filter is stuff that sculpts, generally, frequencies away. Here we are back at our sawtooth default sound, and we're currently in low pass filter mode, which means when I change stuff on this filter unit, we're going to be sculpting away high frequencies. Low pass equals high cut. We're throwing the high frequencies away. So here's a C. Just turn it down so that I can talk over the top of it. And you can see that we've basically got all of the frequencies. Don't worry too much about this drop off right at the upper end of the spectrum. I've got the spectrum analyzer fully zoomed out here, so they're basically beyond our hearing range anyway. We currently have the VCF set at a cutoff of 15,000 Hz, which means at 15,000 Hz, for every octave we go above that, so 30,000 Hz would be exactly one octave, we're going to attenuate or cut away 12 decibels. This is a 12 dB per octave filter. That attenuation rate, by the way, is fixed on some filters. On other synths, you can change the attenuation, you can't on this one. If I pull that frequency control back, you can see the numbers go down. That's going to change the cutoff frequency. In other words, now frequencies above, what is it now, 1.7 kilohertz, all of those are going to get thrown away. Let's see that. Now it's quite difficult to see, but it's about there. There's about 1.7. So this increased slope, it's just a slightly increased slope. That's what you're seeing. Now here's a weird thing about spectrum analyzers and human ears. Everything that you're seeing here is logarithmic, but because the analyzer is also displaying logarithmically, it's going to look like a straight line. So in all of these examples, when you see these straight lines, they're actually getting bigger and bigger and bigger the more that we increase the frequencies. It just so happens that because that's how the human ear works as well, those two things cancel each other out and it sounds like a smooth slope. So let's not worry too much about the maths of it, let's just hear the thing. All the frequencies, cutting the high frequencies away, being left with an ever decreasing number of frequencies, and there we are right down at 20 Hz. We're starting to throw basically everything that can be heard away, every octave, and because 40, 80, 160, it doesn't take very long to the point where we actually can't hear anything. Let's get us back up to a reasonable level. And now I'm going to introduce resonance. The full technical title of this filter is a voltage-controlled resonant low-pass filter. And the word resonance means that at the cutoff point in a low-pass filter, you're going to get a spike, an accentuation of the frequencies at and around the cutoff point. Let's see that. So here we are at 1.6 kilohertz, which is about here on the graph. And as I increase resonance, you can see the bump start to appear. And eventually, if I push it right up to the maximum, we're only a couple of percent away from maximum, the filter will do a thing called self-oscillation, where it begins generating its own overtones. And they're centered around the cutoff frequency, not the native pitch of the key that I'm playing. So they're basically quite atonal and it can sound quite violent. I start sweeping through the frequency curve now. You can hit some really quite unpleasant tones as those resonant spikes just basically really force that particular frequency through. So you need to be careful with resonance right up at maximum, but anything less than 98%, the filter's not going to be self-oscillating and we just get a natural peak, which makes for really nice filter sweeps. Now all of that's a low-pass filter, but this synthesizer actually has 4 different kinds of filters and they're all loaded onto this poor overwhelmed knob over here. Down at the bottom, we're in LPF mode and you can see it says 100% low pass. It kind of sticks, the knob sticks when you get there. You see me pulling it down and when it gets to 100, it kind of snaps in place. That's because there's a point below the low pass filter where we turn it into a band pass. Now band pass makes like a hill, so it cuts away frequencies both above and below the cutoff frequency. So here we are at, let's get to 1 kilohertz, there or thereabouts, that's close enough. And I'll pull the resonance down, and you can see this gentle curve sloping kind of up to 1 kilohertz, because don't forget that everything is supposed to be sloping down. So if you see a flat and it's supposed to be sloping down, it means you've got some sort of filter going on there. And then below, everything above 1 kilohertz, all of these frequencies are being attenuated. Let's sweep a bandpass filter. And now the resonance knob is really going to accentuate that bandpass cutoff frequency. Get sharper and sharper. And there's the self-oscillation again. See, we've got a mountain on both sides, slopes on both sides. At 12 o'clock, when we throw away the low-pass filter, we have a 100% notch filter, which is the opposite of a bandpass. So now we create a valley where we sculpt away the cutoff frequency but leave everything on both sides. And there's a weird feature of notch filters that the resonance basically determines how deep the trough is. So at 100% resonance, the trough is as deep as possible. And as we pull back on resonance, you're going to see it basically bloom to the point where it's a flat line again. Let's try that. So there's the notch basically flattening out. And that's flattening out as much as it can. That's 12 decibels per octave on both sides with no resonance. Let's do a quick sweep of the notch filter. Notch filters can be really useful if you've got one annoying frequency. It's making the synth acting like a little bit like an EQ, where if you don't like the frequencies that are going on at 500 Hz, you can put a little bit of a notch filter on and pull some of that stuff away. And that would look like that. And then finally, everything past 12 o'clock is a high pass filter. High pass equals low cut. So now we're going to be throwing away all the low frequencies. And you hear it get thinner and thinner, because basically at this point we're at 7 kilohertz cutoff now. Now high pass filters are weird because they basically invert all of the logic. At maximum frequency we have no sound. Because we've started at the low frequencies, we're cutting more and more away of the low frequencies, and we end up with stuff that's basically inaudible. And then as we pull the frequency knob down, the low frequencies get reintroduced, starting from the cutoff point and working backwards. And eventually you get to hear an identifiable sound again. And as you can hear, high pass filters are very often very nasal, very sharp and brittle. And there's our cutoff again, really accentuating that point at, it's that 1.4 kilohertz. There we are. Now there's a slightly odd feature about this synthesizer, and it's to do with the modulation knob. It's kind of useless. The reason it's there is because without all of the fancy modern stuff we get in digital plugins, this was the synthesizer as actually originally developed. This was the knob that allowed you to change the frequency. So this was basically a static control. You set your frequency and that was that done. And then the modulation knob allowed you to determine how much one of these modulation sources would control the frequency cutoff. But in real terms, they actually do the same thing. So very often you'd see the word modulation in the filter unit talking about modulation amount, how much of the filter is being applied. That's not the case here. This is modulating the frequency, the cutoff frequency, and we could do that perfectly well with the frequency knob itself. So I'll just demonstrate the equivalence of these two knobs. I've set up the oscilloscope, basically adjusted my zoom and frequency settings so that we can clearly see the shape of the wave. Don't particularly need to hear it very much. Now I'm going to increase the frequency knob. You see that wave squash. And now as I pull the modulation knob back down, we're going to rebuild the wave back to its original state. Stretch the wave out a little bit. Squash it back up. So these two knobs are basically doing the same thing. It's just that this is the modulation control in the original synthesizer as it was developed. And as you can see, we've got the same modulation controls as we saw in the VCOs. We've still not dealt with the envelopes yet, so I'm trying to avoid too much conversation about those specifically. But just like last time, if we put an LFO on, that's basically going to make this filter sweep up and down according to how fast this particular control is. So if I set it to 1 second, it's close enough. You can now see it pulsing once a second. Now, because of the strange drawing of the dotted lines, the VCF box gives me an opportunity to talk about the other two noise sources in this synthesizer. We've got a sub-oscillator and a noise generator. We'll deal with the sub-oscillator first. I'm going to turn VCO1 off. Everything that you've heard today has been coming from the sawtooth of VCO1. Double click it to disengage that, and instead I'm going to introduce the sub-oscillator. Here's the sub-oscillator section, and you can see at the moment it's currently generating a pulse width 1 octave below oscillator 1. This is critically important to bear in mind. Sub-oscillator is intrinsically tied to VCO1. Whatever its pitch is, this is going to be 1 octave lower. So there's our pulse wave. If I switch that to a sine wave, the sound's basically gone away. It's so low that this is not really identifiable. 32 Hertz, I can just about hear it as this kind of thudding low thing. If I go down to -2, now we're generating a wave at 16 Hertz. The tuner can't even pick it up. It's below the capacity for the tuner to actually identify that as a pitched tone. Now you might think to yourself, why do you want to generate tones that you can't hear? Well, one of the reasons is that it is actually still a usable thing. I'm going to dip very briefly into a subject we've not talked about before, and I'll demonstrate how cool the sub-oscillator can be by using the arpeggiator. So I'm going to turn the arpeggiator on, and this is basically going to make multiple copies of this note and octave shift versions. So I'm basically going to have it play this note and the 32 Hertz note and the 64 Hertz note, and you can get some really cool stuff going on. Let's have a bit more of this. So all of these tones, even those low tones, can still be affected by the filter bank, and you can hear that the sub-oscillator is going through the filter circuit. Very cool, I could do that all day. If we flip back to square wave mode, this is the pulse width of the square wave or the pulse wave, and there you can see me in the oscilloscope adjusting the width of the pulse wave, of the sub-oscillator's pulse wave. Very cool. Over on the right hand side of this control, I don't actually know what it's not external, it must be extended. It doesn't actually say in the manual. We've now got a noise generator. And you can generate lots of really cool wind effects using this noise generator. Don't forget, this is a completely independent sound source from the other two VCOs. We could still have a tone sound here. I've just turned the primary oscillators off so that we can just hear the noise generator on its own. So here we have a low pass filter. Resonance increases basically like the whistling of the wind. Let's have some rain. So all of these noise sources go through the entire filter. You've got one filter to control all of the different oscillator sounds. Noise is very often used in minimal amounts. Let's dial a tiny bit of it in when we've got the other oscillators working, and it just adds a little bit of extra harmonic information, a bit of atonal distortion if you like, to the overall sound. Just hear that kind of crackling. There it is. If it's cranked up at small levels, just gives filter circuits a little bit extra to work with all those additional harmonics that are introduced. Basically noises all of the harmonics randomly distributed. There's no particular tonal center around the note that you're playing, and that gives effects units an awful lot to play with if you want to start sculpting the sound later. Okay, that'll do us for the filter circuit. Hope you enjoyed this one. Hit like if you did. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot.